Hello, hello. Yeah, there we go. Hi. So, final day. Thank you so much. It has been a wonderful day so far. I think we should just get into it. So we have Jenny Lyall from the Nunatsiavut government. We have Vicky Smallman from the Canadian Labour Congress, all the way from sunny Ottawa. What a sin.
I think it's rainy Ottawa today.
Don't tell anyone that. You don't have to tell anyone that. We have Joanne Morris of currently the ECE HR Council, but who has had a storied career in early childhood education in this province. And Jillian Pearson, who, let's give her a round of applause, stepped in for Morna, who tested positive for COVID this morning.
Big shoes to fill.
Big shoes to fill, but you can fill them in a blue blazer. So we're going to be talking about system building today, because there's a lot ahead of us. We understand we have a big piece of it was the money, but now it's how do we actually meet the demand and the goals that we've created for ourselves. So I think we just get back into it, because historically early childhood education has been considered an issue that individual families reckon with. We had this market system, us in the US, and Amis, you can correct me, but we were one of the only OECD countries that have a market system of childcare. Now we're moving to more of an entitlement and a public system, but that means the government has to take on responsibility and see that entitlement is real for most kids. As we talked about earlier today, there's a lot of kids who do get missed out. And so, policy makers, we imagine, could be feeling a crunch all of a sudden because, and Mary, we feel for you wherever you are, Mary Goss-Prowse, we feel for you because, you have all of a sudden you have the demands of parents, you have existing childcare providers, and there's all kinds of competing priorities in government. And all this, the focus on kids can get lost because there's so many things that we're trying to meet. So I guess my first question to the panel would be, what advice would you give policy makers on this front? How do we make sure the interests of children stay paramount? And I will start with Joanne, and kind of to the point of Amis's talk just now, how do we balance the interests of employers on the one hand in building a system and early childhood educators?
Okay, well, I really want to start on the premise of the children. And I think in all that we are doing and trying to create, we have to keep the children at the center of all the decisions that are being made. Recently, I've been on the advisory committee to the minister, and we are emphasizing in all advice that we're giving that the interests of the children must be central to all the decisions being made. Sure, there's economic benefits. Sure, there's benefits to people entering the workforce. But really, it's the children that must thrive as we make changes to the system. When children are central, then that places early childhood educators as central to these services. And the early childhood educators must be qualified. It's not good enough any longer to say a warm body with a warm heart is good enough. We need to have people who are knowledgeable about designing environments and programs where children honestly do get a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging with their families, belonging to their communities, belonging to the group they're in. They need to be able to communicate and express themselves, and you do that through play materials. ECEs know how to do this. They make sure that they're creative materials that are open-ended, that children can explore, that they make sure that that's how children answer their own questions. The social interaction that they have is based on what the early childhood educators do in terms of designing those programs for children. So I'm leading into this because we have to start with the children, and that forces us to have to face what it takes to bring quality to any service that we're going to offer. So when we look at the employers, whether they're owner-operators or managers or administrators, they have to be committed to this centrality of purpose. Are they in it to offer the best and the most optimum opportunities for children? Or are they in it for the business? What's their driving force? When they're in it for the quality, then it's really a win-win situation. The children thrive, the families thrive because they have a sense of security. They have high-quality childcare for their children. And then employers will thrive because the demand for spaces is very high. It's been growing decade by decade as we've had women enter the workforce, as research has caused us to look at brain development of children. What is it that's going to be the best for them? And the increase in spaces has skyrocketed recently now that affordability is being addressed. Policymakers really need to understand this kind of dynamic, and they need to be committed to public investments. You might have noticed my question earlier to Emis during her presentation, but we really, really need to understand what a public investment is and what that looks like. When we're transitioning from a primarily privately run system, it's about 80% run through services that are operated as private businesses or small businesses. When we try to transition and transform from a privately run system to, I guess I'll call it a system, to a publicly run, we have to recognize that the private owners have put years and years of blood, sweat, and tears into offering the services. If they hadn't, we wouldn't have the services for the children. But what do we do to make sure that this is going to be there for generation after generation of children? What happens? Well, how do we get employers to say, well, I'm in it because I've made it my business, I've been allowed to make it my business, government hasn't been able to afford to offer childcare themselves. They've encouraged individuals to run small businesses, to offer services. So when those people decide it's time to retire, what happens in that community? In many, many communities, there's only one center or a couple to choose from. What happens when they close? So how do we ensure that it's publicly invested so that year after year and generation after generation, there will be enough, that there will be enough spaces? The current system that we have only offers, so that I'll call it a market approach, that's what it's been referred to, only provides enough services for about 20% of the children who need regulated childcare. The children in families where both parents work or where additional supports are required, or it's the family's choice, but it's only 20% can access regulated childcare. That's not good enough. So now when you make it, now as the governments are making it affordable, we need to, we only refer to it being developed in not-for-profit spaces. And those not-for-profit spaces can be owned by the community. But is it going to develop into a system? Are we going to be able to take what we have currently, help the current employers to maintain service, and figure out how do they become part of a new service, a new system? Do they get out and do we lose? Do we lose 60 spaces in a community because a center has closed? Or do we take that and build upon it? And how do we get employers at the table? They need to be part of this discussion. We can't leave out anybody. It takes a groundswell from a community, but it takes collaboration amongst everybody, the parents, the community experts, the advocates, the government, the current employers, to ask the questions, what will happen in the future? How will we have spaces in the future? What do we want in our communities? What will it look like? So how can we build upon what we've got? Our current administrators are leaders. Our employers are leaders in our community, and we don't want to lose that either. So we need to build on our system, and that puts ECEs in quite a quandary of a space. ECEs have really been caught in this quandary of continuing service, being part of current, looking at future. They represent the quality, but it's expensive to pay, so now it's going to become affordable. Where do they go from here? So I know I'm posing questions, but I'm meaning to because I want to provoke thought. I want people to really think about this. When our conference is titled, Let's Get It Right, we need to really think about all the different ways we're going with this and what it's going to look like in the future. But anyways, there's lots more of this that I'm going to keep coming back to, so maybe we'll see how it works as others discuss this.
I think that sets some very interesting terms for our discussion, right? You know, we're in a marketplace, you have competing interests. And the same is true in a public system, but we have a bit of an obligation to put certain interests ahead and to prioritize others. You know, the labor movement finds themselves in an interesting position to this, and I'm going to turn to Vicky, and this kind of follows on one of the questions that Joanne posed. We have early childhood educators who are workers, and you know, as we heard from Amis, who are facing some pretty big challenges and have been for ever since this profession has existed. On the other hand, you have your workers everywhere who need childcare, and those are almost. I wonder, are there any tensions between those two constituencies?
No.
Well, there you go. Answer.
No, I don't think there are. I mean, ultimately, like the labor movement has been part of the childcare movement since, like, for decades, right? We have worked hand in hand with childcare advocates, with others, to develop a kind of vision for what we want to see in a universal. On a universally accessible, affordable, quality childcare system where every family that wants and needs childcare and early learning has access, right?
Yeah.
And we've worked really hard, in partnership to develop this vision over time, to lobby for it, to agitate for it, mobilize in all kinds of different ways for it. And it's not just the unionized childcare workers who are part of our members that are part of that. It's everybody, right? And now it took a long time. For many years, it was largely the women in the labor movement that were really, pushing for it, because obviously, preaching to the converted here, we all know it's a massive gender equality issue, right? That women can't go to work if there isn't a safe place for their child to grow and learn, and of course because women are the ones doing the unpaid work at home for the most part, right? Still, and that when we don't have that, it just limits your opportunities, right? So it's as part of the feminist movement we've agitated, but I think that the pandemic really showed us. Just how dependent our entire economy is, right, on access to childcare. But this is actually something that we've been talking about for quite some time. We had a campaign a number of years ago called Rethink Childcare, where we would bring workers together to have conversations. We call them kitchen table conversations. And people were encouraged to share their stories and sort of finding, paying for, juggling childcare and just how much of a nightmare it has been for
So these were
people.
workers across sectors.
And yes, and across ages, right, as
Okay.
well. So not just, people who are currently having families, because I think that you forget if you've had your family, you've made your choices, just how tough it was or what you might have had to
Well, you
have
get
given up.
also, I didn't have childcare, so why should you?
Yeah, and so we wanted to kind of promote, like really have some really frank conversations to help people, appreciate that actually, when it comes right down to it, everyone has a childcare story. Everybody does. Whether they have kids or not, they might. We had grandparents that were like being pressured to retire because their kids didn't have access, and they're like, I would rather be golfing right now. Like I didn't work for 40 years just to, give up and then become an unpaid caregiver, right? That's not fair. And then a lot of people telling stories about how lucky they were to find like a spot or how much it cost them. I would tell my own story about having to set up like a black market parent-run co-op because there was no childcare, for my toddler. And then when I finally found childcare, it was like, well, let's just say I'll be paying it off for a while. People don't always appreciate it if you're not living it in the moment, or they may not have recognized how bad it got. And there were some stories of nurses who had to bring their kids to work and had them sleep in the car in the parking lot with them checking on them because they had no overnight care for the night shift. These are not uncommon stories, the things that people have to do, right? So obviously, we knew there was a crisis, and we used this to mobilize support, Well, now we're at this moment where it's very clear how they're actually, like, everyone's interests are aligned, right? And it really, as you started off with your opening comments, ultimately, we all want, it's not just about affordability, we want quality childcare. That is what our kids deserve, that's what our families deserve, and what our communities deserve, right? And we all have an interest in ensuring that this is an amazing opportunity that we have right now, right? An unprecedented opportunity to build a new social program in Canada, right? So we want to get it right, as your conference is themed. But that does require careful planning, and it requires the establishment of, like, the building on a sort of policy consensus. And the good news is that the childcare movement, like nationally, has worked really hard to build a strong vision. And in many provinces and territories, there's roadmaps of what you want to get towards, right? It's the how we get there with the resources that we have and really getting those details ironed out. That is the moment that we're at right now. You have to have a certain amount of trust that we all have the best interests of the system and the kids, right, at heart, right? That we're all working towards the same sort of goal. If we have that trust with each other, then I think that the tensions, there will be tensions for sure. Especially when we're talking about when the profit motive is introduced, it does create some conflicts, right? That's where a lot of the conflicts are. But from the point of view of workers and the labor movement, we really, we really support the vision that's been built over time and want to see it come to fruition, and are going to work really hard to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I think the point about stories really resonates, because this is, and Jillian and I were talking about this earlier, how to some extent this is needs to be a cross-generational movement. Oh, well, every movement does, especially one of this scale. We're looking to transform one of the things, what our society in many ways, and to work together towards something big. But it's a difficult issue because the people who feel it the most acutely are parents, mostly moms, who haven't slept enough and who are trying to figure out childcare. Like, those are the people who have the least time and energy, even though they have the probably the most passionate drive. Likewise, ECEs,
For sure, but then the pandemic hit, and all of that unpaid labor that we already expend just magnified and compounded at ways that have really so destructive, for many, many people. I know, and my kids are older now, but so I'm still a little burnt out, I gotta say, and we're not completely out of it. You really appreciate the importance of having those structures in your community there to help you balance work and caring responsibilities, right? And what the importance of quality is too. I think when you could really appreciate when you have your kids and you're trying to work and all of that kind of stuff, right? So, but I think that we need to, rather than just think that we're going to go back to normal, we need to think about how could it be better, right? Like it was obviously so precarious, right? That it took one pandemic to just to set women's economic justice back 30 years, right? So how do we make sure that now that we're getting things back and we're building this new system, that we do it in a way that makes it stronger?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a question for Jillian in a second now, and I'm not going to ask you the same question I was going to ask Morna. I have a different one, but I think you'll find it good. But I think our childcare stories are important, right, for understanding, for building this momentum, and for building solidarity between people who have different situations. I mean, I think even just about my own experience of childcare, my mom kind of was a bit salty when I started on this, and she was like, it's a bit rich for you to be going on and on about how everyone needs childcare, because you wouldn't go. And I was like, well, I was 3, so give me a break. And also, and she's joking, because in a large part, her decision to stay home was based on her own experience with childcare. My grandmother immigrated to Gander from India, and she was raising 5 kids, mostly on her own in Gander, and she didn't have a lot of family support. And so when it came down to it, she had to go back to work, and she went back to work, and they just had a woman from down the street who I'm sure was lovely, but who came to take care of the kids while she worked during the day, and that was really traumatizing for my mother. And it really informed her decision. She was like, it doesn't matter. She's like, that's not going to be the case with my kids. She's also had to work through university and had worked in some pretty poor childcare settings. And that also informs the way that people see things. So I think that often, when we get below the surface of, okay, either you need childcare or you don't, we all have a story to tell about childcare. And it goes, often the tensions are actually about quality. I know, it's funny, my mom now, she always listens to me on the radio, and she's like, I really like what you said about how the workforce, they have to be paid well, because they need to, that's it. And that's the thing, but people are kind of limited often by the experiences that they have had in early childhood education, and that limits what they can imagine for the future. And I will turn, so now I have a couple questions about, how do we create our vision for the future, given that, the past has been checkered in many ways. And I'm going to ask Jillian, I think you got it started in this as a parent. And so Jillian is one of the organizers with Parents for Affordable Childcare in Newfoundland and Labrador. I would say you're a founder of that. How do you connect with other parents over this? How do you get beyond just the frustration about spaces and price to get to the bigger points of policy? Because I think you're really good at connecting those everyday, really felt struggles with kind of bigger feminist issues, justice issues. Could you speak to that a bit?
So I started kind of my public journey within childcare and early learning advocacy because I had 2 children. They were both under 3 at the time, and I didn't have a permanent position at my place of employment. So I had to go back to work when my youngest was 5 months old, my oldest was 3.5. I was facing a $2,400 a month childcare bill. Obviously, I wanted quality and safety. That was incredibly important to me. But as you can imagine, being on unemployment insurance for the 2nd time in 3 years, my husband is a tradesperson, so often he was engaged in precarious work. That was really, really difficult. And as someone who was middle class, white, English speaking, I was having a really hard time. So I knew then that for all of the privileges and advantages that I had, that the system out there, if it wasn't working for me, then it probably wasn't working for anyone. But I also have a background in public policy and political science, and I'm engaging in some research right now, and my dissertation will hopefully be finished this summer. The irony of being trapped at home with children while you're writing a dissertation on childcare during a pandemic was not lost on me, so it took a little bit longer than I originally anticipated. But it's also really important to recognize that when we are pushing this issue, it's primarily being pushed by women. When I engaged in my research, 98% of the respondents were women or marginalized genders. So there is a huge resource gap there for people who are engaging with childcare services and people who are working in childcare services. They don't have all this extra time, resources, network. They can't afford to take time off of school or work to bang that loud drum. Yeah. So there's a challenge in smaller communities, and especially here in Newfoundland and Labrador, where there's not a whole lot of people who feel safe about speaking out against government or maybe against their employer, whether that's a child care center or elsewhere. So we have to recognize those challenges of just getting this issue out to the forefront. So yes, we do have, we're leveraging this issue that kind of COVID has blown wide open, but the writing was on the wall many years ago in terms of the workforce of the early learning sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. I sat on a family resource center board several years ago, and we had a really difficult time maintaining the ECE workforce for a child care center that we were responsible for. So just recognizing how far we've come is really important. But also, in terms of what advice would you give policymakers, I'm going to kind of infuse that here, is to legislators get out of the way of the public service. I work with federal public service. I work with CRA, actually, so don't tell me that if something is urgent and the political will is there, that you can't deliver on promises really, really quickly. We often think that there's all this bureaucratic red tape, and that is true, or that public service slows down processes. But if we empower them to deliver and implement the plans that we're coming up with, then we can get there. But in terms of the advocacy, is that we're shouldering a lot. Everyone here in this community is shouldering a lot. And sometimes it gets extremely tiring to tell your story over and over. You feel like you are a broken record. You feel like people are sick of hearing from you. So it's just important that we engage as many people and bring them into the conversations as possible and make them feel like they're a meaningful part of the planning and the deliberations, because in this province, early childhood educators, and I'm sure it's not unique to this province, they feel like they've been completely under-consulted, and so have parents. So we really need to ensure that now that we have the money, that we are actually going to the people who are going to be receiving these services as well as delivering them.
Thank you so much, Jillian. And I think that does segue actually very well into what I want to ask Jenny. So, so much of this is about consultation, We have so many diverse experiences, stories, needs in Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada as a whole. We're not building from scratch, but Mary's been in there with just a few people to help her out for a really long time. We're going to be looking at 20 years from now, it's going to be a much bigger department. But at this point, we need all hands on deck. And we need some really good models to engage parents, to engage early childhood educators. And I think from all the reading I've done, some of the best consultation has happened with the Nunatsiavut government in creating the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework. Jenny, could you tell me a bit about that process?
I can.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Jenny Lyall Tamani. My name is Jenny Lyall. So I'm representing the Nunatsiavut government, the Department of Social Development, and I work out of Goose Bay. That's the regional office. My role is I'm the regional childcare manager. I overlook the licensed daycare as well as our unregulated programs. We have 5 Inuit communities. Each community got a daycare, and as well we run Family Resource Center and Aboriginal Head Start program, which is essentially like an FRC, a Family Resource Center. We have Language Nest, which is a Nunatsiavut immersion infant programs. These are on license, and we have play groups and we have after school programs. So we do run a variety of different type of childcare programs within our 5 Inuit communities, as well as outside of those communities in Goose Bay and in Northwest River. So one of the things that we were a part of in 2017, ITK, Inuit Kantami Taparatit, is our Inuit national voice, along with Tugatsugungut Inuit, and the Paktuti Women's Association, which is 2 other national Inuit groups, organizations. So these groups, they conducted a bunch of engagement sessions across Inuit Nunangat. Inuit Nunangat means all the Inuit regions. And within these 8 sessions, their role was to look at the Inuit early learning childcare system. What does that mean? What do we want that to look like? And within that, those pieces of frameworks, each Inuit region conducted their own framework. So we did one in Nain, which is our most northern Inuit community. And from that, we created a vision in partnership with all the other Inuit regions. And the vision is that of the Inuit learning and childcare system, that we want to give every Inuit child the best start to life, no matter where they live in Canada. So if it's in Inuit Nunangat, which is land claims, or outside of land claims, is to be healthy and happy and safe and have the opportunity to learn to speak Inuktitut, to grow up, to be prepared to live in a harmonious life rooted in Inuit ways, and knowing what that means. I always say we should be able to walk into an Inuit childcare center and you know it's Inuit. You know. And we're getting there. You know, you should be able to walk in there. There's Inuit resources on the table. So your core areas, I suppose you call it core areas now, your table, your sand table and your water play, your manipulative area is Inuit. And we've been really working towards that, and we learned that from that framework. The other pieces that come out of this framework that we have worked on, one of the pieces was training. So we entered into a partnership with the college, CNA, and Laurie, if you could take a picture too, the ones, because to show Nunatsiavut I am working. they might think I went to Costco.
You can go to Costco after.
So from this, there's 3 pieces I want to speak to. It was the training piece, because it's similar to the lady there.
No.
I think you spoke to. You know, we are in a place that we hire childcare workers that they got their entry level. You know, we hired them off the streets just so we could get children in the door. And then, you know, we work really hard to try to get them doing their distant education, they do the preschool orientation through ASNL, then they get there, they got to do the distant education, and that's a really challenge. You know, especially on the coast of Labrador. You know, we got one young lady, I think she's been doing it for 8 years. She's almost done. They're not because I'm in church. But yeah, so it takes a long time. So what we did in Nain, so that's our biggest licensed daycare. We have 26 children come, so you know it's a lot of kiddies. So we had 10 staff there between full-time and casual calling, and we might have had 2 had their EC level 1. So we worked with them and worked on first the process of how do we want to decolonize that approach. And so Laurie, who's here, you know, Laurie and another lady come to Nain. We first of all talked to the elders. You know, what do we want this to look like? And we know we had a template that we had to fit into. And the college knew they had a template they had to work with. So it worked quite well. So we delivered it in Nain, and the 10 students did their courses in the summer. They did a number in the summer, and then in the programming year, the daycare operating year, they were on the floor with the kiddies, and then on Wednesday nights they did a course. So within 2 years, they had their EC level 1. Amazing. And that worked so well for that community. And, you know, we would love to be able to do it again in probably Hopedale, which is our other community. But, you know, because taking these folks out, taking them to Goose Bay, generally, it's don't be successful. Yeah. It's hard for them. It's generally young mummies who got kiddies at home, and other life stuff happens. Yeah. So, you know, that worked well. The other piece that came out of this was wages. Now, we probably pay ours considerably better. All of our daycares are federally funded. So, you know, we have that ability. And I have to say now, with new funding, there's new funding happening at different levels. I feel like I'm juggling a lot of balls, but it's the best time to be in childcare. I have to say it. You know, I've been at this a while now, and I was taller one time and I had black hair. That's how long. But yeah, you know, it is an exciting time, and I think it's you know, we are having the ability to work together and you know, work on some of our things. So wages, you know, we do give benefits to our staff. This is the best year I've had in overlooking our childcare programs. I have a lot of continuity, and I think it speaks to how well we work with some of the things that was spoken around benefits and around support. The biggest thing is the training piece, and the other success that came out of this framework when we talked was the cultural piece. So one of the things that we were successful in was getting funding from the federal government under COVID money, and we created these Inuit childcare take-home kits. And those kits was made up of a variety of resources that we had homemade, and that we I guess had our resource center redo that we've done over the years. We have our own. We had elders that wrote their own books in the Nunatsiavut, and so we just redone those. And we had wooden animals made. We had like a seal and skidoos and hummatics, which is like the wooden sleds, a variety of things. And then we purchased a bunch of things that the children would like that was, you know, Inuit specific, because that is hard to get, as you know. Once you know, when you look in wintergreen, when you look in that, it's all, it's not Inuit specific. And if it is Inuit specific, it's generally First Nation. So, you know, that's a bit of a challenge for Inuit regions. But this take-home kit worked really well because COVID, you know, all of our childcare programs shut down. And so we had the ability to put this together, and it was a lot of language stuff in there as well. And I think we sent some out to First Light, and yeah, so we were pleased that we were able to do that. The big thing I think for us is that this is where we want to see for Inuit in Nunangat, is that the development of our curriculum and our programs and our materials are grounded in Inuit knowledge. It is delivered by us, by Inuit, by the Nunatsiavut. One of the challenges in being that is the licensing. And even though, you know, we still have to meet the needs of the license, being licensed is a good thing. I
Jenny,
don't mind that.
I'm going to ask you more about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you more about that in the next question.
one.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There you go.
I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah,
There you go. Good. No, because I think there's two separate issues there.
Is,
I think, no, because what I'm hearing is, you know, you start from this consultation. And I think one thing that, from reading the report that you submitted to the ITK, how many people, over almost 30 people were at that consultation?
The one in Nain?
Yeah, in the Nain, from all the way up and down the coast, and that's not easy or cheap to do.
Yeah.
I mean, we brought a few people to St. John's for this, and I almost had a heart attack. My God, it aged me 10 years. And so that work is really important.
Yeah.
Getting everyone together to come up with that vision. Then you find the policy pieces that fit into that. And for you, it sounds like training was important, and licensing, which we'll talk about.
And the culture.
And the culture, absolutely. So to the point, once we consultation is important, public engagement is important. But then the issue is implementation. And that's where we where there sometimes is a bit of a disconnect. Our provincial government action plan, we're seeing a lot of reliance on the not-for-profit sector to deliver early learning and childcare programs. And so I'd like to talk a bit about what the benefits are and the disadvantages. So, there's some things that are great about not-for-profit delivery, but as opposed to public delivery, things there are some things that are different. On the one hand, a local not-for-profit might be able to identify needs that in their community that, somebody in St. John's might not be able to. But there are also can be some pretty big drawbacks. I wonder, Joanne, could you comment a bit on what this means for the workforce and the people who work in the sector?
Yeah, this question, when you sent these questions out, they really got me thinking. And, we're talking about this federal money coming as though the ELCC service is going to become a public service. And relying on the not-for-profit sector does not make it a public service, and it does not make it universal. Even at $10 a day, there will be many families who can't afford to participate. The federal government has attached strings to the money to say that it must be, if it's used for expansion, it must be in the not-for-profit sector, because they're trying to build in some level of accountability for the public money being spent. For Canadian tax dollars being spent, how will they ensure it's not going to go to individuals as private profits, but how will it be reinvested back into services so that the services themselves can be advanced? So we've got to be really clear about this, because it's not the same. We really need to keep working at this, because we need to keep working at it becoming a public service. I think there's more benefits in it going in that direction than not, but I'll just explore a few of them from the workforce perspective. ECE, the cost for ECE wages and benefits is about 80% of the operational costs of programs. And they are the very people who are key to quality, but for as long, like before affordability became possible, they were the ones that were shortchanged, because if you paid ECEs more, parent fees skyrocketed. So parent fees couldn't go any higher, and so wages stayed low. Now it's being made affordable. If ECEs belong to a public service, then they're public employees, and they would have a commitment from the government to have their salaries, their wages, their benefits paid for, and their rights. They are protected by our public unions, as well. So that ensures that in a publicly funded system, we truly have that kind of protection and support for the workforce. If we look at the investment as it's going right now into the not-for-profit system, not-for-profits vary from organization to organization. A wage grid will determine the wages, but there's no commitment to paying for benefits yet. So some organizations can afford to pay for good benefits, and some for hardly any at all. And when not-for-profit organizations do well, so will the workforce. But when money gets tight, the ECEs will again be held back from advancement. So in a publicly funded system, we're building a system, a guarantee. In a not-for-profit system, we're adding a layer to a currently privately owned system, which has been a patchwork approach to offering services. Now we'll have another level where money's going to go into the not-for-profit sector, but they're all independent of one another, except for those that are multi-site. But, you know, when you start to look at community organizations, they're all independent of one another. So what's that system going to look like? And where do the ECEs get their guarantees for good wages and a commitment to these wages and these benefits over time? One of the benefits to the not-for-profit system is that they are based on community organization and community support, and it offers the opportunity for parents and community experts and ECEs to work together on designing what these programs look like. If it's a community in Port-au-Port, it may look different than a community in St. John's. So it allows for that varying of differences. In a publicly funded system, as good as it is for guaranteeing wages and benefits, it can be quite hierarchical in many situations. We know that if we look at our education and our health systems, who's making all the bucks? It's people at the top. So if we end up with a hierarchical system, what generally happens is services then are all cookie-cutter approach. They've got to look alike, they've got to act alike. It's like Walmart. You know, going to Walmart anywhere in the country, they all look alike. You know, every department is turn the corner, oh yeah, it's over there, you know. But so we don't want that either. And that's where we've got to figure out as we go forward with this money, we have a wonderful opportunity here to build a system, but it's got to be reflective of our communities, whether they're Indigenous communities like Jenny's described for us, or Indigenous communities as we had over lunch with Joanne over on the West Coast there. You know, what do they need to look like? And how do we get that community flavor to what the services are going to be like? What do we want? How do we get them to look like this? And yet, how do we support the workforce and make sure that it's secure and advances as we do this? There's a lot of work to be done. There's a period of transition, but what we're talking about is a total transformation. Can we get to the publicly funded, publicly guaranteed service or not? We're not there yet. The federal government has never invested in public education. So we have a lot of work to do to get this right. I'm glad we're here talking about it. All these little bits and pieces and steps and discussions and viewpoints from parents and Indigenous populations and unions. We really need to keep talking about this. We really need to work at it to get it right. The organization I represent is going to be responsible for developing the wage grid. I was so excited about getting the proposal written and getting it in and getting it funded, and now I'm terrified. I really am. It's like we got 2 months to do it in, or 3 months, and it's got to be done. Can we do it well that soon? You know, and if it isn't going to include benefits, what do those salaries mean? You know, salaries and benefits are both needed for our workforce. Our ECEs, many of them are parents themselves who can't afford childcare for their own children. How often I've heard that from ECEs. So we've really got lots of work to do, and we've got to look at all these different factors and try to get the best from each model, and look at the research that's been done, like Emmis has talked about, and what researchers through the Atkinson Foundation have done, and other foundations, and the Pratt Foundation. But really look at what it's telling us, and what are the bits and pieces that we can glean from this to make it the best system that will truly secure that workforce into the future. Because without the quality, we're wasting our time. We've got to have equality, and that means that the workforce as Emma's talked about this morning, has to be, or earlier this afternoon, has to be invested in, and it has to be done well.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I feel like, you're very good at linking all these different issues, all these different themes together, because truly, when you're a moderator and you're writing out your questions, it's all false distinctions. All these things influence one another. We're lucky at this table between Jillian, who's been on the board of not-for-profit childcare, and then Jenny, who actually operates some publicly funded childcare. I think that we could definitely get some very interesting insights from both of you. First, though, I would like to, are you okay?
I'm good.
Okay?
Yeah.
First,
I was just making a couple of notes of things I wanted to remember. So.
Excellent.
It's all good.
Vicky, I would, to the point of, unionization and the labor movement, what are the differences in how the labor movement can support workers in the not-for-profit sector versus the public sector? How, for the uninitiated to labor movement nuances such as myself.
All right, well, I just want to back up a couple
absolutely.
of steps, actually, because I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between public funding, public management, and public delivery, right? And and you can have a combination of all of those things, right? So what we want is a system that is fully publicly funded, right? That doesn't rely on parent fees. The parent fees are minimal. Ideally, you would have a sliding scale from $0 to $10, right? So that, because you're right, there are many people for whom, if you have multiple kids, $10 a month actually,
a day
does not, you're not going to be able to afford that, right? So you need to build that in. So that's, we want that public funding, and Joanne is completely right that, this is a human resource heavy industry, right? So much of what you need to spend your budget on are the people, the workforce, the people that are there. And there's ECEs, but there's other people in the childcare workforce as well, right? People who are cooking, cleaning, there's administrators and so on. And you have to think about them as well, right? So I know we often talk a lot about the importance of ECEs and qualifications, but you want people with decent work in all areas of the childcare workforce.
You want a good cook, for sure.
For sure,
or else no one's eaten anything.
Well, yeah, and we've heard the importance actually of food to ensuring cultural relevancy, diversity is included, making people feel like they belong, and healthy food, is also really important for kids' outcomes and quality learning. So you need to have everybody covered. So public management means that there's sort of some direction and some oversight, right, in terms of the delivery, but doesn't necessarily mean that the services are going to be public services or publicly run, right? But it's managed in a way, it's planned and so on, and that can look like different things depending on who's involved in the public management, right? But and I think that what we want, right, is some planning, some coherence. You want a vision, and you want accountability, you want transparency in decision making, you want consultation, and for everybody who's all of the stakeholders to be part of decision making, right? And because you want that investment, right? And the example of the Indigenous frameworks is a really good one because it is very rooted in that sense of community. Whether it's the Inuit framework or the First Nations or the Métis framework, and each one is different. And so on, right?
I read those and I want to cry because they're so beautiful. Then I read the normal early learning and childcare framework and I want to fall asleep. I think there's,
I think there's lessons to be learned there, right? Yeah. It's rooted in value and culture and community, right? And that is what you want for your early learning system, regardless, right? And then in terms of the delivery, publicly delivered, it could be a public service, it could be run through schools, right? And in some places, it is run through elements are run through the school system, right? You might have, and here we're talking about that, right, with the pre-K thing. And in Ontario, where I come from, we have the all-day junior kindergarten, junior and senior kindergarten, which is co-run between teachers and ECEs. And then you've got potentially not-for-profits, but sort of under the framework of this public management, right, is I think what we're talking about. And then in terms of the unionization, you don't know, so I mean, regardless of whether you're employed by a not-for-profit provider, a for-profit provider, or the public provider, everybody deserves the protection of a union if they want, you know, like the right to organize and bargain collectively over your terms and conditions of employment and your wages is a universal human right. Right that has been entrenched in Canadian legislation, right? And it's a tool to be able to level the playing field between workers and employers, to be able to kind of hammer out what your working conditions are going to be like, your wages. You have a process where you can resolve grievances and so on. That's, you know, and so there's no difference between public servants or public employees and employees of not-for-profit or for-profit agencies, although I don't know many for-profit unionized facilities in Canada. Maybe they exist, but I don't think so. But it could happen. But all of those things are the same, right? Like there's no difference between that. Now, it's true, and we heard about this morning, that workers who are represented by a union in the public system, and you know, some places, have way better wages and access to benefits and so on, right? Mm-hmm. But you can have that in the not-for-profit system as well. It is tougher if it's fragmented small employers, right? Mm. So there you can talk about something like sectoral bargaining, where groups of employers can get together and maybe you could have a common pension plan or a benefits plan, so that a small not-for-profit provider would be able to afford to offer good benefits to somebody. And that is where the public management can also come in, where that role of government is to facilitate some of these structures and able to allow you to problem solve some of these things that you were talking about, right? Good. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing why unions need to be at the table, you know, in the advisory committee, in setting up this system, in, you know, and in some of the, you know, community consulting. I would argue you would want municipalities involved too, especially in a place like Newfoundland where you have so many communities out in sort of remote regions. You need to have that problem solving happening at the community level, like we've seen can work in the Indigenous framework. So I don't know, that's, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to say that there's an argument to be made for unions to have a role at this early stage of building this new system, to sort of be brought in as partners, and not necessarily, I mean, eventually there'll be negotiating relationships depending on how the system evolves, and that will ultimately be up to the workers themselves. They, you know, you choose the union that you're going to belong to, and there's going to have to be organizing that happens, and I would love to see more childcare workers unionized, like any workers. But Newfoundland has a good record. You have a high rate of unionization here, so you have a lot of strength to build from, and also a lot of unions that have been really involved in advocacy for childcare movements. So you're, you know, I see a lot of hope really in the room.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you, Vicky. So I think, you know, we have some experience at this table about what it's like to problem solve. And a lot of the folks in the audience and all of us have experience either on, you know, on not-for-profit boards, on advisory committees, and kind of, you know, we're the ones who end up ultimately figuring out, seeing these tangles and trying to work out a solution. I'd like to ask you, Jill, tell me a bit about your experience, you know, being on the board of directors of the Family Resource Center.
So I served on the board of a family resource center here that spanned kind of like an urban-rural divide. It was the Kilbride to Fairyland Family Resource Center. And one of the major issues was wages for both the ECs that were working in the Babels Child Care Center, as well as the educators who are working in the family resource centers. A lot of people don't realize they don't necessarily qualify for the wage supplement that ECEs get in licensed childcare centers. Sure. So when it comes down, I can speak from experience that when it comes down to deciding where money is going to go, most boards are painfully making the decision to keep it in programming and keep wages stagnant. And that's a really difficult decision to make. And at the end of my term, we ended on a divided board essentially that wanted to bring all the wages up to a living wage for the St. John's area. and we just didn't have the funding to get there. So to Joanne and a lot of other people's points, not-for-profit childcare delivery does have its perks, but our society and our government expect a lot from them. And we historically expect them to do a lot more with less because we think that they are the experts, that they've been doing this for so long, that this is their targeted niche, that they should be able to do whatever we want them to do with the limited budget. And sometimes on a really tight cycle. So they don't have these long-term agreements. So they are wondering from year to year what their funding is going to be like. So I think both from someone who has witnessed the difficulties that not-for-profit care has experienced, but also as a parent and an economic researcher, we really do have to base, is not-for-profit care the best decision for this particular community? Is fully publicly owned and funded childcare possible and relevant for this community? There's a lot of private care providers right now who are really scared about talking about public funding. Like Joanne said, we do have to recognize that they've put a lot of time and effort into building their systems. And while they are for-profit, for the most part, a lot of women who own these licenses are operating very similar to not-for-profit boards because they're just getting enough money to keep the lights on and keep themselves and their staff paid. The issue where we really need to clamp down is that because this influx of government money has been realized in the last couple of years in these fragmented policies of subsidies and the operating grant, a lot of investors have realized that if they buy up multiple licenses, they can scale these profits. That's really where we need to nip this in the bud as we try and transition into this system. It's one thing for a woman-owned business to have a couple of licenses and they're employing other women in the community. It's another thing for an investor to say, if we can get up to 6 licenses and make $40,000 off every center, well, now that's a good investment. We need to stop that. So we don't need to scare or fearmonger a lot of the women who are operating on a smaller scale. We need to bring them with us. And of course, we have an aging population. A lot of these operators are becoming older. Then we can have these discussions about buying their licenses, maybe via the public system or the not-for-profit system. But there's some rural areas who could benefit from a for-profit family regulated based, and that may be the only option available to them right now as we strive towards a perfect system. But again, accountability is really important. Not-for-profit boards can add that added layer of accountability. But as Enos indicated in her earlier report, if we're going to create this pipeline, and we are going to say, wages should be at a certain level, then we have to make sure that we're not fixed in the zero-sum game forever that we're in Newfoundland right now. Because if we put up wages in a publicly funded, publicly owned system, then we're going to bleed ECEs from other areas, and then those spaces are going to be shut down. So I am in entire agreement that we need a coordinated approach, a community needs-based approach, and not-for-profit can play a role, but we also need to figure out a way to take, for now, what we call for-profit, smaller, mainly owned, women-owned operators with us.
Thank you so much, Jillian. And I think you're right that often it is a community by community question, right? It's what makes sense, because we are in a time of transition. We're not starting from a blank slate. We're starting from a history of having childcare in this province, much of which has been for profit. We also have family childcare. So we have a lot of existing operators, and we have to operate in that ecosystem. We're not starting from nothing. We're starting from something that already exists. But sometimes the option is that you want to deliver public childcare, and I think the Nunatsiavut government operates some of your own childcare childcare or licensed childcare centers. How do you make those decisions? And how do you decide where a licensed childcare center will go? How do you decide where, actually the need is met in this community? What does that process look like?
So we generally take that from what the community is wanting.
Yeah.
So we have a consultation with each of our community, and if it shows, I guess really the community population stats show that they need a childcare program, so they would reach out to our department, and that would then come through me, and they say, Jen, we have mums that's talking to us, and we need a childcare program. And maybe it might be not an unregulated childcare, and that's generally a lot easier. The regulated childcare is the challenge, and that's what I was, going to speak to, is regulated childcare is a really hard thing, and it's not just in Labrador, it's on the island as well, and it's because these regulations, they're a great thing. Being regulated, we want to see that, because at the end of the day, you want good staff and you want a good building. And, the regulation speaks to that, but how it's done. And it's done within two departments. So there's the department, it's the Service Newfoundland and Labrador, so that's to do with your whole building. And then you have the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, so they do the programming pieces. I don't think these departments speak to each other, because when you're doing the licensing is really hard, and as well, they're very complex. And I know the building process changes, and I've been doing this a while now, and I still get lost in that complex world of that licensing of the building stuff. And it's how it's done. And it's the relationship, and I don't know, and I think we really, stepping from here and speaking for Nunatsiavut, we need a strategic plan. And within that plan is that discussion with that department that, these workers, they're told to do a job, but it's how it's done. That relationship is not very good. Staff get anxiety when they know these workers are coming in to do their site visit, because their site and they enforce it. It's not a guiding process, and it's not supportive. And this is what we love we want to run regulated childcare. So I guess when a community is asking for some type of childcare, we kind of juggle what it looks like, but we're at the mercy of the regulations, which hinders. Because when you want to deliver regulated childcare, because it gives you the ability to take more children.
Yes.
Yeah, unregulated childcare, you're only allowed 4 kids at a time, or so many hours. So yeah. That answer your question?
Oh, yes, it does.
Ramble on.
No, my gosh. I think we should leave it there. We've kind of, because, we started a bit early, but we can finish a bit early as well. I'd like to thank you all so much. Very quickly, we have time for maybe 2 questions from the audience. Is there anything? Oh, we got a hand up. And we got a second hand up. Gone. Going, gone. Okay, 3. The 3 you can have. The rest of you.
Then you're cut off.
Then you're, no. And be quick.
I'll be quick, but I don't know if you'll be quick with my answer. I'm an owner of a private center. I'm not going to say for-profit or not-for-profit, because private is private, and I would like to know how they're going to encourage all of us private owners of little centers, as everybody has spoke about, to come under the system. The operating grant is there, and the operating grant is working good, and there's lots of ways that I think that it could work, but we have to remember that, personally, I don't want to give away my center. I've given my center a good quality and a good name, and I want it to remain good in name. So is the government looking at, rather than just opening up a public system right across everywhere, are they looking at making sure that we maintain the good quality we have? And I know that there is centers that don't have good quality. I've been around for a long while, and I know that there's people who are buying up centers so they can make profit too. So how do we answer those questions?
I don't think, oh, yeah, is my mic on? Does it seem like? Okay. I will actually speak to that very quickly. First of all, I don't know how, it's tricky when we ask what government's doing, because I don't know what they're doing, but I'm sure they're figuring it out. But that said, I will say that that's an issue that we heard a lot in our consultations for the paper that we talked about earlier. In partnership with Sky Taylor, we ran some consultations for providers, and we heard a lot of the same concerns from for-profit and not-for-profit operators on that point of transparency and wondering, you know, what's it going to look like next year? There's so many changes coming to our sector. And if for example, one thing that came up a lot is if pre-K comes in, we're going to lose our 4-year-olds. We heard that from for-profit centers, from not-for-profit centers. And it makes a really big difference to the way that your model works, to whether the numbers even out, whether you're having 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, or you're having infants. And so people really were concerned about that, and they wanted to know what's coming down the pipeline so that they could adapt to it. And you know, I would go further and say that there's also going to need to be support to adapt as well, because again, it's more expensive to take infants than it is to take, on an operating cost, it's more expensive to take infants than it might be to take toddlers. That's something we definitely heard a lot, and it went across for-profit and not-for-profit. It was, you know, the numbers have to add up, no matter how it works out in the end.
When we made the shift to a full-day junior kindergarten in Ontario, that was a huge issue, right? And a lot of all the centers, whether they were, you know, smaller private operations or nonprofit, like freaked out about it. And in the end, most of them did just adapt to expand their preschool programs, and it worked out okay, but it's not without like struggle, right? You could look at what, and I mean, all of these plans are still evolving, right, in most provinces and territories. I'm not sure there is an answer to your question yet, but
yeah, I don't think publicly there's an answer.
You know, there might be, I don't know, but I will say that in Quebec, when they first brought in their $5 a day childcare years ago, right, their system on which this whole thing is based, there was a kind of a plan, an initial plan, that the centers that weren't part of the sort of the public CPEs, as long as they met the standards, they received the funding, and the funding was to the center. So they were part of the system and invited to be part of the system. I think there was initially a long-term vision to eventually bring them in, but the idea was to not have not exchange one form for another form, but to grow the system entirely by building on that foundation that already started. So, I mean, that's one sort of place that you could look to, but I'm not sure what the...
And I don't think we're in a position at this point, the wait lists are pretty much crisis mode here in Newfoundland and Labrador, to crowd anyone out, and that did happen in Quebec, you know, initially during the growing pains of introducing more affordable care. And I think if we are putting, you know, the child at the center and quality at the center, then we do have to recognize, you know, the unique situation that we are in with a lot of really good quality private providers, and not force them out, but come up with a unique solution that, you know, if and when they want to age out or retire or relinquish, that, you know, they give government first option to get that license or something like that.
Yeah, I think there'll always be room for private operations. I can't see it changing unless they change the legislation to say otherwise. You know, if someone comes forward and wants a new license and it's going to be a commercial center, I don't think the government can turn them down if they meet all of the requirements. The legislation would have to be changed in order to deny that license. So as long as standards are met, they will. The other thing that is in the favor of the existing centers is the operating grant program, because everybody can get that. In some provinces, they restrict the amount of public funding that can go to private operations, whereas in this province, the OGP ensures the wage grid will be based, and also the OGP will be based on the new wage grid. So I think that continued kind of support will continue to be there. And we can't afford to lose the spaces that we have. So and even in Quebec, there still are for-profit centers.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and as we've all talked about, the demand is going to continue to grow. In Quebec, it grew so much, so greatly within the first few years that it was open, that they couldn't deny anybody licenses. I mean, they had to keep it all going and grow it at the same time. And already here, our politicians, our governments are getting constant calls from parents saying, you said it's affordable, where's the space? You know, it's not there. The pre-kindergarten development is another anomaly for sure. It does have an effect on existing programs and the viability of existing operations. I personally think they really are developing junior kindergarten, but right now, as we see with the way that it's been designed, without our input, is that their children at 4 can go, but you have to pay. But when they're 5, you don't have to pay anymore. Like, you know, like there's really a long way to go in the development. But Mary, I think that certainly, you know, there's lots of room for private operations and now and into the future.
I'm not worried about my operation being, like, I have enough parents who are going to come to me for the next many years, but I want to make sure that my staff get whatever benefits anybody else gets.
Yeah.
You know, like, if the rest of, if in the public system they're going to get the benefits and pensions or whatever they're going to get, that's what I want for my staff too.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that's built into
just
the
for-
operating grant program.
Yeah, just for the purpose of the live stream, the concern was that, you know, from the questioner was that, you know, if there's going to be wages and benefits that go to folks who are working within the public system, she'd like her employees to get the same access to wages, benefits, pensions, whatever is arranged.
Yes, Vicky is very good at it. Taught me something new last week, which is that if you can, do speak on the mic, because some folks might not be able to hear if you're not speaking in the mic. But no, we're excellent. Thank you, Vicky. There was another question.
There's one in the back.
There's one in the back. Okay, so we'll go. You figure out your route.
Okay.
Oh, it's you. Excellent.
Yeah, it's me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm Brianna. I work with Deb at First Light. And so we're about to start our strategic planning process for the next 3 to 5 years. And daycare expansion is going to be a part of that discussion. And we're sort of struggling a little bit with the pressures on the nonprofit sector to create these new spaces and balancing that with sort of some of the noise in the sector around wanting to put some pressure on this public daycare system. So I guess, you know, from the perspective of the panel, would you advise that energy go into that advocacy for more of a public system, or do you think that energy is worthwhile to spend on expanding daycare spaces using a model that we've sort of been developing for the last several years?
Can I add that?
Yeah, go for it.
I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Easy for you to
No, seriously, because right now there's an immediate need and there's going to be expansion and it's going to be quickly, and you really do need to build on the foundations that you have, right? But you also want to work towards something, right? And so that's why you need to be at the table to be part of that conversation, no matter what kind of, where you are within the spectrum of people that are within the childcare universe. So I think you want to have, you want to be able to meet the immediate needs and, grow your programs as quickly as you can to meet the demand that will inevitably come, especially if you're providing excellent quality childcare. But then you're going to want to make sure that you know where you're going, right? That there is a plan going forward. And I think that that's the trickiest thing right now, is because there is this sort of hurry up and wait type of thing that's happening. And there is a danger that we might further entrench the existing patchwork, and there's also so you want to have a bit of a plan, right? We need a strong workforce strategy, and I think that's one of the things that isn't being discussed by a lot of governments in a sort of really robust way, right? So you want to make sure that there's a strategy for expansion that is planned and you sort of know where you want to go. And we were, a few of us were in Ottawa at a conference last week. It's very well timed, this discussion, because we were just talking about all of this. And I think that many of the sort of the childcare movements, the national organizations, are really looking at now establishing some really clear principles around what this expansion is going to look like as all of these plans get nailed down at the provincial and territorial level, so that there is some consistency. You know, if we're building a system of childcare for everybody, it's not going to look the same everywhere. We're not talking about one size fits all. And even within systems in a province and territory, people have different needs, right? And communities have different needs, kids have different needs, and families have different needs. So it's not all going to look like exactly the same, but in the same time, there's got to be some principles, values, standards. It's got to be planned, it's got to be managed, and there has to be accountability baked in. That's the role that governments play, is making sure that they set up systems where there's some accountability for the standards and some measurement and evaluation as the system grows. So I think you should put a little bit of energy into your expanding, and then a little bit of energy into advocacy with everybody else, right? So if you have a kind of really good provincial advocacy association, if you don't have one now, you should be sort of, this is what this should become, right? Childcare Now has set up, provincial organizations in a number of places. I don't think we have one yet here in Newfoundland, Labrador, but maybe
There has been in the past.
There was in the past, a
yes,
coalition,
yeah,
right?
Certainly.
And a New
Well,
Brunswick.
there was also an advocacy
Yeah.
association here. In fact,
Yeah.
the president of the advocacy association was a Newfoundlander.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're, like, New Brunswick had a sort of dormant association. They've just revived it. Nova Scotia has created a new one. I think you'll see this happening in a lot of places. It really helps to kind of bring people together around a common vision.
And the saying, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is really important here as we transition from this patchwork system. So there is going to have to be communities who hang on to models that do serve their needs. And First Light does have a really good reputation as a not-for-profit childcare provider. So if it's working right now, there's no reason why you can't, fill the need and keep that model going right now as we all kind of navigate this together. And in 10 years' time, the needs might be much different. Maybe the advocacy community might be different, but I think that's something we're still all working through.
Joanne or Jenny? Would either of you like to add anything?
Just for the ladies that are from First Light, one of the things that on our Inuit EC working group, so that's other reps like myself from across Inuit Nunangat, one of the things we are really trying to fight for is money for urban Inuit childcare. We're not sure what that looks like. We know for Nunatsiavut, we have a lot of families that come here to St. John's. So one of the things that we want to see is funding that will come to programs like yourself that's going to supplement what you do. So I think I have your information. Hey, we connect. I'm not promising anything here, but there should be something happening.
Yeah.
Joanne, would you?
Oh, no, I think that's something that we're going to talk about after.
Joanne, would you like to add anything?
I just wanted to add, I guess maybe what I started with was about keeping children central to all the decisions that we're making. So I'd like to just sort of end by saying that children are citizens of this country, and they have rights. And we, as the public, have a responsibility to make sure that children's rights are supported and that there are goods and services there that support them in their early years of development. So we've gone all around, talking about how to best do this, but we've got to still come back and keep looking at the fact that this is based on children, and children's rights are valued. One of your questions was around values. I almost called you Robin, sorry.
No, fair enough. People call me worse.
And we want a society that children are valued. And so however we manage to do this, we've got to keep them central to this.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Last question, Bernice. Can we get the mic over? Thank you, Lauren. Bernice always has good questions.
All the questions have been good.
Yeah.
No pressure at all here, Neil. Should I start singing, I wonder? No. I guess for me, I have this book at home called Living Through the Meantime. And that's what this feels like. There's a lot of questions and and you ladies did an excellent job, by the way. So it just really feels like living through the meantime. And, in rural and remote areas of the province, which I live in, and we work in, and we struggle as a nonprofit to provide licensed family resource programs, school-based family resource programs, most of them, and community-based, and also school-based licensed preschool programs and childcare, infant childcare programs in rural and remote communities. So while we're having these consultations and discussions, we've had generations of children. I'm a grandmother, right? We've had generations of children living through the meantime and not availing, right? Not able to avail. They tell, one of the questions Neria had for us, what gap were you filling? Well, it was a hole. It wasn't a gap. There was nothing. There was absolutely, and this is like many communities in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, right? So that's the reality of it. So while we're having all these discussions, I would just like someone to say, would you please provide these nice nonprofits who've stepped up to the plate for many years, who stepped up to the plate, and our private, who stepped up to the plate in rural and remote communities with the transportation money to get the children to the preschool program.
Yes.
Or to the early learning and childcare program. Yeah. Or the family resource center.
All in favor? Motion carried.
Yes. Thank you. Whoa. Oh, gotcha. So that brings us to the end. Thank you so much. I was gonna, and don't worry about the poll thing. We're good. We'll leave it there. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone. It says closing remarks at the end, but really, what are closing remarks? Like, we did it. Well done. But I would like to thank a few people. First of all, I'd love to thank Mary Shortall and Morna Ballantyne, who first of all put up some money to help us make this real, which is really wonderful. It's wonderful to gather in person. Even when it's not perfect, it's never going to be perfect. But the world keeps turning. Pre-K starting in September, so it's important that we do get together when we can. And I'd like to thank both the Federation of Labor and Childcare Now for their support in making that happen here. I'd also like to thank a few people who couldn't be here. So Sky Taylor, who you all know, who's the best, and she was a huge part of making this happen today, and it's devastating that she couldn't be here. I'd like to thank as well the folks who our panelists, many of whom traveled to be here. It's not easy, it's not cheap in this province, and we do appreciate that. And yeah, all the folks who did travel to be here, it's very meaningful, and I think this is the Jimmy Pratt Foundation. Our first meetings, we didn't really have anyone from out of town, and that's been a really big priority for us going forward. And so, we'd love your feedback on how that experience has been. But with that, I think we'll let you all go. Thank you so much. Thank you. On your way out, grab a cinnamon bun to go. Bring it for your kids, bring it for whoever, but there's lots of food left. Please take it, and I will be here for the next half hour or so. So, thank you.